April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. Oberlieutenant Ralph Hermischen couldn't stop smiling as he watched the American fighters struggling to climb toward his formation. These things looked ridiculous. Barrel-shaped bodies, greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed way too small for their massive frames. He grabbed his radio and transmitted to his wingman, barely able to contain his laughter. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles." Within 18 months, that laughter would completely disappear, because what the Germans saw as the worst fighter ever built was hiding something they never saw coming. If you want to see how this ugly beast became the most feared machine in the sky, hit that like button, smash subscribe, and turn on notifications. What happens next is wild. Let's get into it. So there's Hermischen circling high above with his Focke-Wulf 190, and he's watching these American P-47 Thunderbolts trying to catch up. And honestly, you can't blame him for laughing. These things were absolutely massive. We're talking about fighters that looked more like flying bathtubs than actual combat aircraft. The fuselage was barrel-shaped, just this big round body topped with a greenhouse canopy that made the whole thing look even more awkward. And the wings, way too small for how heavy the thing was. The proportions were all wrong, like someone designed a bomber and then decided halfway through to call it a fighter. Here's what made it even funnier to the Germans. They'd been fighting Spitfires for years. Sleek, nimble, beautiful machines that danced through the sky. Those things were elegant, purpose-built. Every line screamed speed and agility. They'd faced Soviet fighters that could turn on a dime and climb like rockets. The Germans knew what real fighters looked like. These American contraptions. They looked like somebody's weird engineering experiment that somehow got approved for combat. Corpulent, ungainly, almost comical if you're being honest about it. The propellers alone were bigger than anything the Luftwaffe had in their inventory. Just massive spinning discs attached to this bulky body that seemed to labour through the air. Watching them climb was painful. They weren't graceful, they weren't fast. They just sort of lumbered upward, like overweight birds struggling to gain altitude. The 2,000 horsepower engines were straining against 7 tons of aircraft. 7 tons. That's heavier than some twin-engine bombers from just a few years earlier. Get this, though. The 16 P-47s struggling up toward them that morning were piloted by guys who'd never seen combat. Not once. 0 days of actual fighting. These were the 4th Fighter Group's boys, fresh from training, making their very first appearance over occupied Europe. They didn't know what it felt like to have tracers flying past their canopy. They'd never had to make split-second decisions with their lives on the line. Green doesn't even begin to describe it. Meanwhile, Hermischen and his squadron? These weren't rookies. They'd been in the war since 1939. Poland, France, Britain, Russia. 4 straight years of non-stop combat experience. Veterans who'd survived everything the Allies could throw at them and came back for more. They'd shot down hurricanes over the English Channel. They'd duelled with Yaks over the Eastern Front. They knew every trick, every tactic, every way to exploit an opponent's weakness. And weaknesses? These P-47s seemed to have plenty. The confidence wasn't arrogance, it was experience. When you've been fighting for 4 years and you see something that looks this bad, you just know. The Americans didn't understand European air combat. They'd built something that violated every lesson the war had taught so far. Big meant slow. Heavy meant you couldn't turn. That bulky frame meant you'd never outclimb anyone. Everything about the P-47 screamed easy target to pilots who'd been doing this since before America even entered the war. The math didn't add up in America's favour. Experienced killers in proven fighters versus green pilots in machines that looked like they belonged in a junkyard. Hermischen transmitted his observation about flying milk bottles and settled in for what he assumed would be a straightforward engagement. His wingmen were probably smiling too, watching these ungainly beasts struggle toward them. What could possibly go wrong for the Germans? So where did this weird machine even come from? June 1940. France is falling apart. The Germans are tearing through Europe with fighters that are dominating everything in the sky. And the US Army Air Corps? They're panicking. They need something that can match the Luftwaffe's best, and they need it yesterday. They send urgent specifications to Republic Aviation, and the job lands on the desk of this guy named Alexander Kartveli, Georgian-born chief designer. Brilliant mind. And he's looking at what they're asking for and realizing there's no way to build what they want without breaking every rule. Kartveli gathers his design team and tells them something wild. "It will be a dinosaur," he says. Just straight up admits it. But it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. That's the pitch. We're building something massive, something that doesn't look like anything else flying, but it's going to work. Trust the process. May 6th, 1941. The XP-47B prototype takes its first flight, and everyone who sees it just stops. You know that moment when you see something so unexpected you can't quite process it? That was this. The thing weighed 9,900 pounds empty, just sitting there on the tarmac with no fuel, no ammunition, no pilot. Nearly 5 tons of aircraft. That's 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Not a little heavier. 65%. That's not iteration, that's revolution. And the shape? Listen, there's no polite way to say this. It looked pregnant. The turbo supercharger system running through the rear fuselage gave it this bulging appearance that made people do double takes, complex ducting, snaking through the body. All this engineering packed into a frame that seemed to defy logic. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't pretty. It was just big. Test pilots would walk up to it for the first time, and you could see the question forming before they even asked it. This thing actually flies? Every single one of them said some version of that, because nothing about it looked aerodynamic, nothing about it suggested grace or speed or agility. It looked like a mistake that somehow made it off the drawing board and into metal. But here's where it gets interesting. It didn't just fly. It flew in ways that shouldn't have been possible for something that heavy. The designers had done something nobody else was attempting. They'd thrown out the European playbook entirely and built something uniquely American. Big, powerful, over-engineered to an almost absurd degree. The whole aviation world was watching. Some were curious, most were skeptical. And the Germans? They had no idea this thing even existed yet. They were still celebrating victories in Europe, confident their fighters were the best in the world. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, this pregnant-looking dinosaur was about to start its journey from joke to nightmare. All right, so what was making this beast actually work? The engine. And not just any engine. We're talking about the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, pumping out 2,000 horsepower. That's an insane amount of power for a single-engine fighter. Most engines at the time were lucky to hit 1,200, maybe 1,500 horsepower. This thing was pushing 2,000. Just raw, brutal force turning that massive propeller. But here's where the magic really happened. That turbo supercharger everyone thought looked weird, that bulge in the fuselage that made the P-47 look awkward, that was the secret weapon. See, most fighters back then used mechanical superchargers. They worked fine at low altitude, but the higher you climbed, the thinner the air got, and the less power your engine could make. By the time you hit 20,000 or 25,000 feet, most fighters were gasping, struggling, losing performance with every 1,000 feet they climbed. The P-47? It didn't care. The turbo supercharger was fed by exhaust gases, spinning a turbine that compressed incoming air before it hit the engine. What that meant was the P-47 could maintain sea-level performance at 27,000 feet. Let that sink in. While German fighters were choking on thin air at high altitude, the Thunderbolt was running like it was still on the runway. Full power, full performance. The engine didn't know the difference. This is where all that weight everyone was mocking suddenly made sense. You can't just bolt a turbo supercharger onto a lightweight airframe and call it a day. The system needed complex ducting running through the fuselage. It needed cooling. It needed reinforcement. The P-47 wasn't heavy because the designers didn't know what they were doing. It was heavy because they were building something that operated in an environment where nothing else could compete. German fighters would climb to intercept bombers at 25,000 feet, and they'd be at the edge of their performance envelope. Engines struggling, controls getting mushy, pilots sucking oxygen through masks while their aircraft barely maintained speed. And then here comes this American fighter cruising up to meet them like altitude was just a suggestion. The power advantage at height was so dramatic it didn't even feel fair. Think about it from the German perspective. You're used to having the high ground. You're used to diving down on your enemies from above, using gravity and momentum to your advantage. That's how air combat worked. But now there's this machine that can meet you up there and still have power to spare. The rules were changing, and nobody on the German side realized it yet. The weight everyone laughed at? That wasn't a bug. That was a feature. All that mass meant the P-47 could dive like a stone. We're talking 400, 450, even 500 miles per hour in a dive. Speeds where other fighters started coming apart or losing control. The P-47 just kept accelerating. That reinforced frame, those overbuilt wing spars, the entire structure designed to handle forces that would tear lesser aircraft to pieces. So you've got this high-altitude monster with more power than anything else in the sky, built like a tank and capable of speeds in a dive that German fighters couldn't match. The Germans were still judging it based on how it looked and how it climbed. They hadn't figured out what it was actually designed to do. That realization was coming, though, and it wasn't going to be pretty. So the P-47 is getting ready for combat, and the Army Air Corps sets up training at Bridgeport, Connecticut. Major Hubert Hub Zemke gets assigned to command the 56th Fighter Group, and he takes one look at what he's supposed to train his pilots on and just hates it. Absolutely despises the aircraft. And you know what? He had good reasons. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th lost 18 pilots, 41 aircraft destroyed, and they hadn't even seen combat yet. This wasn't the Luftwaffe shooting them down. This was the P-47 itself. The thing was unforgiving in ways that caught everyone off guard. You made a mistake in a Spitfire, maybe you'd get away with it. You made a mistake in a P-47, the aircraft punished you for it. Ground loops were a constant nightmare. You'd land, think everything's fine, and suddenly the aircraft would swap ends on you, just spin around on the runway like it had a mind of its own. The torque from that massive engine and propeller meant if you weren't careful on takeoff, the whole aircraft would try to roll over. New pilots would add power, and suddenly they're fighting to keep the wings level. It wanted to kill you before you even got airborne. And then there was the diving. Pilots would push the nose down, and the P-47 would just go. Accelerate like crazy. But here's the problem. At certain speeds, the controls would freeze up, completely lock. It's called compressibility, and back then, nobody really understood what was happening. The aircraft would be screaming toward the ground at 500 miles per hour, and the pilot would be yanking back on the stick with everything they had, and nothing would happen. Some guys figured out you had to trim the aircraft to pull out. Others didn't figure it out in time. Zemke watched pilot after pilot struggle with this beast, watched good men get hurt or worse trying to master something that seemed determined to fight them every step of the way. The training program was supposed to prepare them for combat, but it felt more like the combat was happening in Connecticut, against their own aircraft. But here's the thing about the guys who made it through. The ones who survived that brutal training period and actually figured out how to fly the P-47, they discovered something incredible. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, this farm boy from Oklahoma who'd go on to become one of America's top aces with 27 victories, he described his first real flight in the P-47 like this. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. That's the perfect way to put it. You didn't really fly the P-47 in the traditional sense. You aimed it. You pointed this 7-ton machine in a direction and let all that power and mass do its thing. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't elegant. But once you understood what it wanted to do, once you stopped trying to make it behave like a European fighter, something clicked. The power was absolutely unbelievable. Guys who'd flown other aircraft would get in the P-47 and just be shocked at what that engine could deliver. Push the throttle forward and you could feel it in your chest. That R2800 didn't just make noise, it made the entire aircraft vibrate with raw energy. When you opened it up, when you really let it run, it felt like the thing wanted to tear itself free from the laws of physics. The visibility from that greenhouse canopy? Once you got used to sitting so high up, it was actually amazing. You could see everything. No blind spots. No guessing what was around you. In combat, that would matter more than anyone realized during training. And the cockpit itself was roomy. Comfortable even. Pilots who'd been crammed into tiny fighters suddenly had space to move, space to think, space to work. So you've got this situation where the P-47 was actively dangerous to the people learning to fly it, but the ones who mastered it? They found an aircraft that could do things nothing else could. The question was whether those survivors could figure out how to use it in actual combat before the Luftwaffe tore them apart. April 1943 was coming. Time to find out. April and May 1943. The P-47s finally make it to Europe and start flying combat missions. And guess what? Every single thing the Germans thought about them turned out to be right. At least at first. The P-47 couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190s. Not even close. German pilots would break into a turn and the Thunderbolts would try to follow, and it was like watching a semi-truck try to keep up with a sports car. The P-47 would just keep going in this big, lazy arc while the 190 was already coming around for another pass. The weight, that 7 tons everyone was worried about, it showed up in every turning fight. Physics doesn't care about horsepower when you're trying to change direction. Climb rate? Forget about it. The Messerschmitt 109s could outclimb the P-47 without breaking a sweat. German pilots would see the Americans coming, point their noses up, and just leave them behind. The P-47s would be straining, engines roaring, and the 109s would already be 1,000 feet above them, setting up for the next attack. That high-altitude advantage the P-47 had didn't mean much when you couldn't get to that altitude fast enough. The handling at medium altitudes was just clunky. Other fighters felt responsive, like they were extensions of the pilot's hands. The P-47 felt heavy because it was heavy. Everything took more effort, more stick force, more rudder input, more planning ahead because you couldn't just flick it around like the nimble fighters everyone was used to. German pilots who'd been doing this for years could feel that sluggishness from a mile away. So naturally, the Luftwaffe developed tactics to exploit every single one of these weaknesses. They'd attack from below where the P-47 struggled the most. Force-turning fights where agility mattered more than anything else. Bait the Americans into situations where that weight and size became a liability instead of an advantage. And it worked. The early combat reports weren't good for the Americans. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, he was commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter units. Guy was a legitimate ace, knew his stuff. After his first encounter with P-47s, he sends a report back to headquarters. And the tone? Dismissive, doesn't even cover it. These American fighters weren't a threat. They were targets. big, slow, clumsy targets that couldn't compete with German aircraft or German tactics. The confidence in the Luftwaffe was sky high. They'd been right about the P-47 from the beginning. It looked bad, it flew bad, it fought bad. The Americans had built exactly what everyone thought they'd built. A fighter that didn't understand European air combat. Too heavy, too slow in the turn, too easy to exploit. Every engagement seemed to prove it. American pilots were getting frustrated. They'd survived that nightmare training back in Connecticut, mastered this difficult aircraft, made it across the Atlantic, and now they're getting schooled by German veterans who made it look easy. The P-47 had all this power, all this engineering, all this American industrial might behind it, and none of it seemed to matter when a 109 could just climb away or a 190 could turn inside them. The 4th Fighter Group, the 56th, all these units that were supposed to escort bombers and challenge the Luftwaffe for control of the sky. They were learning hard lessons, the kind of lessons that get people hurt. German pilots would come slashing through formations, pick off stragglers, and disappear before the P-47s could even react. Speed was the only advantage the Americans had, and they weren't using it right yet. Priller and his fellow Luftwaffe pilots had every reason to believe they'd continue dominating. The P-47 couldn't do what their fighters could do. Basic air combat was about turning, climbing, positioning, and the Americans were losing all three. The math seemed simple. Experience plus superior aircraft equals victory. That's how it had worked for 4 years. But something was shifting. The American pilots who were getting beat up in these early fights, they were learning. Not how to turn with the 190s. That was never going to happen. Not how to climb with the 109s. Physics wouldn't allow it. They were learning something else entirely. They were learning to stop trying to fight like Europeans. The P-47 wasn't designed to dogfight at medium altitude. It wasn't built to turn and burn with nimble interceptors. So what was it actually built for? The Americans who survived those first brutal months were starting to figure it out. And once they did, everything was about to change. So here's where everything flipped. American pilots stopped trying to dogfight. They stopped trying to outturn the 190s or outclimb the 109s. Because why would you? Why would you fight the enemy's fight when you've got an aircraft that can do something they can't? The tactic that emerged wasn't complicated. It was actually beautifully simple. Get above them, dive down, shoot, keep going, climb back up using all that speed you just built, rinse and repeat, boom and zoom they called it. And the P-47 was absolutely perfect for it. See, when a P-47 pointed its nose down, it didn't just dive. It fell like a brick wrapped in an engine. That 7-ton weight everyone had been mocking, now it was an advantage. Gravity plus mass plus that massive engine still producing power equals acceleration that German fighters couldn't match. The P-47 would hit 400 miles per hour, then 450. Some pilots pushed it past 500 miles per hour in a dive. Those are speeds where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs started having serious problems. German pilots would see the P-47s above them and think they were safe. They'd start positioning for their attack, focusing on the bombers or setting up their preferred angles. And then this American fighter would come screaming down from above like a meteor. By the time the German pilot realized what was happening, the P-47 was already on top of him doing 100 miles per hour faster than his aircraft could handle. And this is where those 8 synchronized 50 caliber Browning machine guns entered the conversation. 4 in each wing, all firing at the same time, all converging on the same point in space. When a P-47 pilot pressed that trigger, he wasn't just shooting. He was unleashing something the Luftwaffe had never experienced before. The math was simple and terrifying. 3,400 rounds of ammunition loaded across those 8 guns. Combined rate of fire, 6,000 rounds per minute. That's 100 rounds every single second. The sound alone was distinctive, not the pop-pop-pop of smaller caliber guns. This was a roar. a sustained, thunderous hammering that you could hear over the engine noise, over the wind, over everything. A 2-second burst put between 200 and 300 rounds into the air. At typical engagement ranges, maybe 300 to 400 yards, enough of those rounds would hit to guarantee destruction. We're not talking about damaging an aircraft. We're talking about sawing it in half. The concentrated firepower was so intense that German fighters would just come apart. Wings would separate, fuselages would break, control surfaces would disintegrate. The first time German formations experienced this, they didn't know what hit them. 1 second they're in formation, setting up their attack, everything's normal. Next second, there's this howling sound from above, and one of their guys just explodes into pieces. No warning, no chance to evade. The P-47 was there and gone before they could react, already climbing back up for another pass. German pilots who survived these attacks started reporting back with a completely different tone. This wasn't the clumsy fighter they'd been laughing at. This was something else, something that used tactics they couldn't counter. You can't outturn an opponent who isn't turning. You can't outclimb an opponent who's diving on you from 5,000 feet above. All your experience, all your skills in traditional dogfighting, none of it mattered when the fight happened in 3 seconds of vertical action. The psychological impact was massive. German pilots were used to being the hunters. They'd spent years perfecting their craft, learning how to position, how to attack, how to control the engagement. Now they were prey. Now they had to constantly look up, constantly worry about what was above them, constantly wonder if that speck in the sky was about to turn into a 7-ton hammer travelling at 450 miles per hour. And the worst part for the Germans? The P-47 pilots didn't have to stick around. They'd make their pass, shred whatever they hit, and then use all that speed to climb right back up out of reach. The Germans couldn't chase them, couldn't catch them, couldn't force them into the turning fight where Luftwaffe experience would matter. The Americans controlled when and where the fighting happened. By summer of 1943, German combat reports started changing. You could see it in the language: less confidence, more caution, warnings about American tactics, instructions to avoid getting caught below P-47 formations. The swagger was gone. The mockery was gone. Now it was just survival tips for dealing with an opponent who'd figured out how to use every advantage their aircraft had. Major Donald Blakesley, the Eagle Squadron veteran who'd been flying Spitfires before switching to P-47s, he understood what was happening. The P-47 wasn't a European fighter trying to be something it wasn't. It was an American fighter doing things the American way. Big, powerful, overwhelming. Built to take advantage of altitude and speed and firepower. Built to drop out of the sky like a thunderbolt and destroy whatever it touched. The Germans had been right about what the P-47 couldn't do. It couldn't turn worth a damn. It climbed slowly. It was heavy and clunky at medium altitude. But they'd been completely wrong about what it could do. And what it could do was more than enough to change the war. Those guns, though, those 8 Brownings, they were about to get a nickname that would haunt German pilots for the rest of their lives. The Germans gave those 8 machine guns a nickname: Roosevelt's piano, because when they fired, when all 8 of them opened up at once, it sounded like someone playing keys on a piano. Except instead of music, it was the last sound a lot of Luftwaffe pilots ever heard. Once you heard it, you never forgot it. That distinctive hammering rhythm. 8 guns, slightly out of sync, creating this rolling thunder that announced death was incoming. But it wasn't just about the sound. The ammunition itself was doing things German pilots hadn't seen before. American .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds. These things used a delayed action fuse that let them penetrate before they detonated. So the round would punch through the aluminum skin of an aircraft, get inside the structure, and then explode. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum, hot enough to turn a fuel tank into a fireball. hot enough to melt control cables and framework. German fighters were using cannons, 20mm shells, sometimes 30mm. On paper, those sound way more powerful, right? Bigger explosive charge, more destructive per hit, and they were, individually. But here's the problem. Cannons had limited ammunition. A typical German fighter might carry 120 to 200 rounds total across all its cannons. That's maybe 10 or 15 seconds of firing time if you're lucky. And you had to be accurate. You had to hit precisely because you couldn't afford to waste shots. The P-47 had 3,400 rounds. Even if you held the trigger down continuously, you had over 30 seconds of firing time. But more importantly, you didn't need to be perfectly accurate. Those 8 guns created what you'd call a probability cloud, a cone of bullets spreading out toward the target. Even if your aim was a little off, even if you weren't perfectly lined up, enough rounds were going to connect. At 400 yards, a 2-second burst guaranteed hits. Multiple hits. Devastating hits. Gun camera footage from P-47s tells the whole story. You'd see a German fighter in the crosshairs, then the tracers start reaching out and the target just disintegrates. Not gradually, not piece by piece. It would be flying 1 second and coming apart the next. Wings folding, fuselage breaking, pieces spinning away. The sustained fire from 8 guns hitting simultaneously was more than any aircraft structure could handle. And here's something the Germans really couldn't wrap their heads around. The P-47 could take the same punishment it was dishing out and keep flying. Pilots were coming back with damage that should have been impossible to survive. Massive holes in the wings, chunks of the fuselage missing, control surfaces shot to pieces, engine cylinders blown out, and the aircraft would still bring them home. There's stories of P-47s landing with literally hundreds of holes from cannon fire and machine gun rounds. The armor plating around the cockpit actually worked. That self-sealing fuel tank technology the Americans developed actually worked. The redundant control systems actually worked. German pilots would pump rounds into a P-47, see hits, assume it was done, and then watch it just keep going, keep fighting, keep flying. That overbuilt structure everyone thought was unnecessary, now it made sense. Those wing spars rated for 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's actual weight, meant you could lose parts of the wing and still have structural integrity. The doubled control cables meant if one got severed, the backup would keep working. The engine mount designed to handle 12 G-forces meant even if the engine took hits, it often stayed attached and kept running. Lieutenant Robert Johnson had an engagement where his P-47 took hits from a Focke-Wulf 190 at close range. The canopy was shattered, the fuselage was riddled. He counted over 200 holes in the aircraft after he landed. 200. Any other fighter would have gone down. The P-47 brought him home. Stories like that spread through both sides. American pilots gained confidence. German pilots gained fear. By late 1944, the dynamic had completely shifted. German formations would scatter when they heard Roosevelt's piano starting up. Experienced aces who'd been fighting since 1939 were developing tactics specifically to avoid P-47s. Not to fight them, to avoid them. That's how much respect, how much fear that machine and those guns had earned. The sound itself became a psychological weapon. German pilots, decades after the war, would talk about it. That rolling thunder, that sustained hammering. The sound meant there was a P-47 somewhere close, probably above you, probably lining up a shot, and you had maybe seconds to do something about it. The confidence from April 1943 was completely gone. The laughter was gone. Now it was just terror and desperation and hoping you weren't the next target. The Americans had built a fighter around a philosophy the Germans didn't understand. Maximum firepower, maximum survivability, tactics that used weight and power instead of trying to overcome them. And it worked. It worked so well that the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was being systematically destroyed by an aircraft they'd initially dismissed as a flying milk bottle. But the guns, the tactics, the survivability, that was only part of the story. The really scary part for Germany. America was building these things by the thousands while fighting a war on two sides of the planet. So let's talk about the really terrifying part for Germany. The part they couldn't do anything about no matter how good their pilots were or how clever their tactics got. America built over 15,000 of these things. 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. While fighting a war in Europe and the Pacific simultaneously. While supplying allies. While building bombers and transports and every other type of aircraft you can imagine. Think about what that means. Each P-47 required an R2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders, 2 rows, thousands of precisely machined parts that had to work together perfectly. That engine was more complex than anything Germany was producing, more complex than the engines in Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, and America was cranking them out faster than Germany could build simple fighters. That's not just winning, that's dominating on a level that makes the actual fighting almost irrelevant. The engineering philosophy behind the P-47 was pure American thinking. If something might break, make it stronger. If it might fail, add a backup. If there's any doubt about structural integrity, overbuild it to the point where failure becomes impossible. The wing spars could support 40,000 pounds. The aircraft's loaded weight was maybe 13,000 or 14,000 pounds. That's 3 times the actual load. Why? Because American engineers weren't taking chances. The engine mount was designed to handle 12 G forces. Nobody was ever going to pull 12 Gs in combat. It was physically impossible for a pilot to remain conscious through that. But the mount was built for it anyway, because if it could handle 12 Gs, it could definitely handle anything that would actually happen in combat. Every single component had that same philosophy. Over-engineered, overbuilt, excessive by any reasonable standard. The ammunition feed system alone was a marvel. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each holding 425 rounds, each feeding through electric boost motors to prevent jamming during high G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude. Each gun had its own charging mechanism. Each could be individually synchronized. The convergence point where all 8 streams of bullets met was adjustable from 150 to 400 yards, letting pilots optimize for their preferred engagement range. This level of engineering, this attention to detail, this redundancy built into every system, Germany couldn't match it. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the industrial capacity, they were building fighters as fast as they could with whatever materials they could find, and quality was starting to slip. Meanwhile, America was building P-47s that were not only more capable but more reliable and more consistent than German aircraft. And here's something that really mattered. When P-47s met German fighters in equal numbers, the Americans consistently won. Not sometimes, not occasionally, consistently. This wasn't about overwhelming numbers or having 10 P-47s gang up on one Messerschmitt. In one-on-one situations, in equal fights, the P-47 came out on top more often than not. The German argument that they were only losing because they were outnumbered didn't hold up when you looked at engagements where numbers were actually equal. The heavy machine gun armament that German pilots had dismissed as inferior to cannons proved more effective in actual combat. That probability cloud of bullets guaranteed hits. Those armor-piercing incendiary rounds guaranteed damage. The sustained fire time meant P-47 pilots could engage multiple targets in a single encounter. German fighters would fire their cannons, hit or miss, and then they were reloading or out of ammunition. P-47 pilots could hold the trigger and just keep shooting. Even after the war ended, some German veterans tried to maintain that their fighters were technically superior, that the Luftwaffe lost because of numbers, not quality. The combat records don't support that. Gun camera footage doesn't support that. The kill ratios don't support that. The P-47 wasn't winning just because there were a lot of them. It was winning because it was better designed, better built, better suited for the actual war being fought. Republic Aviation had created something that represented everything about American industrial might. Brute force backed by unlimited resources. Nothing subtle about it, nothing elegant. Just raw capability stacked on top of more raw capability until you had an aircraft that could dominate through sheer, overwhelming presence. The P-47 didn't dance through the sky like a European fighter. It owned the sky through power and durability and firepower that nothing else could match. German factories were getting bombed. Resources were running out. Quality control was slipping. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. And all the while, more P-47s kept showing up. Fresh aircraft, fresh pilots, unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, unlimited everything. That's what fighting America's industrial capacity looked like from the German perspective. An endless wave of heavy fighters that you couldn't turn with, couldn't climb away from, and couldn't damage enough to stop. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from World War I. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids who were barely out of high school and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks, not years. That's American industrial philosophy in metal and engineering. Build it big, build it tough, build it in quantities that make the enemy's production look like a hobby. The Germans had been confident their experience and their fighter designs would carry them through. They'd been wrong about both. Fast forward to 1985, Phoenix, Arizona. There's a reunion happening, and it's not your typical gathering. German and American fighter pilots who spent the war trying to shoot each other down are meeting in peace. Former enemies sitting together, sharing stories, probably having drinks and trying to process everything that happened 4 decades earlier. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland is there. This guy was the head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm during the war. He'd commanded thousands of pilots, developed tactics, made strategic decisions about how Germany would fight in the air. If anyone understood what happened from the German perspective, it was Galland. Someone asks him about the P-47. The question gets recorded on video. His answer? It's pretty stunning. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, he says. There's no hesitation, no sugarcoating it. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand." He keeps going, talks about how the Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. And they were right. Coming from a guy who spent the entire war fighting against the P-47, that's an admission that carries weight. But here's where it gets really interesting. Galland talks about flying a captured P-47 after the war ended, getting in the cockpit, feeling that power firsthand. "The first time I flew one," he says, "I understood everything." The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable. The visibility was excellent. The controls were precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. What really impressed him, though, was the realization that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting on 2 sides of the planet. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced. Yet they built them faster than Germany could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. And then he talks about the guns, Roosevelt's piano. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it, he says. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. That's coming from a guy who commanded some of the best fighter pilots in history. Pilots who'd fought on every front, survived years of combat, won hundreds of victories, and they were terrified of those 8 Brownings. There's another quote from the display at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. An unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. The war's just ended. Everything's fresh in his memory. He says, "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." That's the whole story right there. The transformation from joke to nightmare, from mockery to terror, from confidence to desperation. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. Not through numbers alone, not through luck. Through design philosophy that the Germans never saw coming and couldn't counter even when they understood it. April 8, 1943. Oberlieutenant Ralph Hermischen was laughing at flying milk bottles struggling to reach his altitude. By May 1945, there weren't any German pilots left to laugh. The Thunder had spoken. 8 synchronized Browning machine guns had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare, and the sky belonged to America. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision. It ended the war as an instrument of domination, and 40 years later the guys who'd fought against it could finally admit what they'd known for decades. They'd underestimated everything about it: the design, the tactics, the industrial might behind it. The Americans had built exactly what they needed to build, and the Germans had mocked it right up until the moment they realized they were beaten. That's how you win a war. Not by building what your enemy expects, but by building what they can't counter. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into military history that'll blow your mind. Drop a comment and let me know what aircraft or battle you want covered next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.